Welcome back, everyone, to this last scene of the conference. And even though I will not dwell too much on introducing our keynote speaker, I really must tell how happy I am to have here next to me Holly Case, whose work is, even though it's not only East Central Europeanist, in a sense, I think was very important for a lot of us to start thinking differently about the region. And I think that's enough to introduce Holly. So the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. I'd just like to start by thanking Gabor, and I've known Gabor for a very long time, and not least of all, when I was writing my dissertation, I sent him a draft and he sent me like reams of pages of comments, and that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship for which I'm ongoingly grateful. And it's wonderful to see this this project coming to fruition. It's a bit sad also, but I think very exciting what has come of it, and also some of the insights that I've seen. I want to apologize for dropping in late. I'm quite certain that my time is not valuable, but somehow it gets sucked up nonetheless. So the title of my talk is History Hacking in Downtime, some thoughts on where someone has been and where someone else is headed. And I'd like to begin by explaining the decidedly cryptic title I've given to my presentation. So what do I mean by history hacking and downtime, and who exactly has been somewhere and who is headed somewhere else? The easiest way to explain is by use of a common metaphor, the metaphor of the locomotive, which you're familiar with. It starts with Marx, who viewed revolution as the locomotive of history, on to Rosa Luxemburg, who in her reflections on the Russian Revolution posited the possibility that if the forward movement of the revolution is not consistent and strong enough, especially on an incline, that it either drives forward full steam ahead to the most extreme point of historical ascent, or it rolls back of its own weight again to the starting point at the bottom. And then comes Walter Benjamin, who acknowledged Marx's original assertion, namely that revolutions are the locomotive of world history, but he offered this correction. Perhaps it is quite otherwise. Perhaps revolutions are an attempt by the passengers on this train, namely the human race, to activate the emergency brake. And then there's Vladimir Nabokov, who described being on a train that itself remains stationary while the platform departed of its own accord. You can see in this change over time an accumulation of doubts about the potential for and even the desirability of forward movement that was once the promise of revolution. In the 2013 film Snowpiercer by the South Korean director Bong Joon-ho, the title role is played by a train circling endlessly on a circuitous track around the globe. The world is completely frozen over and covered in deep snow from an unsuccessful attempt at climate engineering. The train is organized hierarchically with the most powerful figure, the mysterious godlike Wilford, at the front, and a group of extremely poor people in the back. The train must keep moving at high speed to create the energy required to run it, and also to prevent the tracks from snowing over. A group in the back starts a revolution that pushes forward through the various cars of the train with the aim of ultimately seizing control of the engine. It's a revolution within a revolution. Eventually, one of the revolutionaries makes it to the engine to confront Wilford, only to realize that the whole thing was a ruse, co-planned between a revolutionary in the back and Wilford in the front, as a means to maintain the entire system. Meanwhile, a Korean couple and a small child who appear throughout the film as self-interested thieves and drug addicts who are only interested in where their next fix is coming from have secretly been saving up explosive material, and they blow out the side door, which sends the train careening off the tracks and into the snow, presumably killing most on board, including Wilford. Only the Korean woman and child survive to step out of the blown side door into the snowy world, which is desolate, but the sun is shining, and a polar bear is visible in the distance. End of film. Snowpiercer is arguably the last gasp of the locomotive as a metaphor for revolution. In it, the revolution has been literalized and repeated ad infinitum. The locomotive has come to represent exactly the opposite of what Marx envisioned, and is now effectively an authoritarian prison that no one can change or leave. One question I would like to consider here today: is anti-colonialism or post-colonialism a side door? Is it the side door that can be blown out of the ongoing train? It certainly has some transformative potential and is gaining strength, so much so that it is arguably usurping the hegemonic status once occupied by democracy, which not so long ago was the global standard for competitive state legitimacy, as states jockeyed to declare themselves the better, the more truly democratic democracy. Now the very notion of democracy is intensely contested. And should anti-imperial and decolonial be the new shorthand for confronting the vicissitudes and various manifestations of power? And what role should the work of historians play in all of this? And what do either of these questions have to do with Marx's locomotive? Our field, however we choose to define it, has always had to know what's going on elsewhere, both geographically, temporally, and methodologically. We are like Peter Esterházy's Cosmopolitans when he wrote, "It's like someone who has always lived in Munkács and has never left Munkács in his entire life, but who has been nevertheless a one-time Hungarian, one-time Czech, one-time citizen of the Soviet Union, then a citizen of Ukraine. In our town, this is how we become cosmopolitans." It's not a virtue necessarily, it's just a fact of the region's historical experience. Likely it blinds us in some ways, as Natasha Wheatley's excellent new book on the life and death of states shows. Thinking from here doesn't necessarily get you anywhere in particular, and historically at least, is likely to take you off the ground entirely into the seductive heavens of pure abstraction. And it's abstraction that I'm worried about, even though I'm also fascinated by it. Or rather, I'm worried precisely because it is so devilishly fascinating. A lot of us think we don't engage in abstraction, and yet insofar as any of us can be said to apply a historical methodology, we most certainly do. It's the workings of this machine of abstraction we call methodology that I want to talk about here today. In the 1820s, when Leopold von Ranke set out to write the history of the Serbian uprising, what he did was ask his buddy, Vuk Karadžić, to send him some stuff, which von Ranke then compiled into a book. Though we tend to shorthand von Ranke's method in his own words, wie es eigentlich gewesen, as it actually happened, it was not much of a method. Marxism was different. It was built on a set of insights from the past, abstracted into general tendencies or patterns so as to capture ever broader swaths of geography and chronology in the same frame. Marx argued in favor of what he called the force of abstraction. He did not give much airtime to individual experiences. In Das Kapital, he insisted that any individuals mentioned were merely, quote, personifications of economic categories, embodiments of particular class relations and class interests, unquote. Out of this emerged Marxism as a historical methodology, and arguably, in some sense, historical methodology as such, since the patterns and rules of history derived by Marx and Engels could be picked up, moved over to another context, and reapplied, like a machine that turns the often grotesque and confusing material of experiences and quantities into something with form and meaning. Incidentally, Arendt thought that Marx might have gone a little overboard on the meaning front, calling him the first and still the greatest among historians to mistake a pattern for a meaning. There was a famous Hungarian mathematician by the name of Pál Erdős, who was so prolific and so utterly involved in everything mathematical in his day that every living mathematician today still is said to have what's known as an Erdős number that indicates their degree of separation from the original Erdős. Even young mathematicians rarely get above a 3. The equivalent in history is likely Marx, who arguably brought method to history, and he did it at a time when lots of areas of inquiry were starting to gather insights gleaned from analysis of many sources, observations, and statistics, and generalize them into patterns and then into operations. It was in 1843 that Ada Lovelace contemplated in writing the implications of the analytical engine that was invented but never built by Charles Babbage. The operating mechanism can be even thrown into action independently of any object to operate upon, although of course no result could then be developed. Again, it might act on other things besides number, were objects found whose mutual fundamental relations could be expressed by those of the abstract science of operations, and which should be also susceptible of adaptations to the action of the operating notation and mechanism of the engine. In this thought experiment, Lovelace imagined computing as we now understand it. Computing works by performing operations, which were described by Lovelace as any process which alters the mutual relation of two or more things, which things, she extrapolated, could include all subjects in the universe. This is nice, and it's how historical method works too. Experience to aggregate, to insight, to pattern, to application of pattern to experience, to aggregate, to insight, to pattern, to application of pattern to experience, etc. It's this feeding back in part that's of special interest to me. And I think methodologies, historical, tend to feed back in insights in this manner. Nationalist historiography, Foucauldian analysis, environmental historiography, psychoanalytic. It's built up from insights that are oftentimes collapsed into patterns and then reapplied. Let's listen to how Lovelace describes an operation. The symbols of operation are frequently also the symbols of the result of operations. We may say that these symbols are apt to have both a retrospective and a prospective signification. They may signify either relations that are the consequences of a series of processes already performed, or relations that are yet to be affected through certain processes. At first reading, this offends not only the brain, but also the sensibilities of the historian, playing fast and loose like that with words like retrospective and prospective as if they're interchangeable. And yet this is exactly what historical method often does. It's what I'm doing now by historicizing something, namely Marxism, that takes historicization as its own method. But if method were just a self-replicating machine, we'd be stuck. And it happens quite often in historiography that someone argues that we are stuck, running the same operations over and over again on different material, but deriving similar unimaginative results. In his second book, The Reconstruction of Nations from 2003, Timothy Snyder did it with the metaphor of an icebreaker. Conventional wisdom, he wrote, is like a sheet of ice covering the dark sea of the undiscovered. Does the narrative flow like water over the smooth surface, or does the narrative move like an icebreaker sailing under its own power, identifying problems and confronting them? does it leave in its wake a view of the deep, a black line through white ice, a passage that others may follow. Quite an image. The National Indifference School was a bit more subtle in its formulation of the problem, but ultimately made a very similar assertion. But the funny thing about method, and this is also true of single operations applied over and over again on a body of material, is that it's not actually a self-replicating machine. Quite the contrary. It seems to open infinite channels for novelty. Yet there is another funny thing about it, and that is that the more that it's applied, the less those operations seem to work like you mean them to. It's almost like they take on a life of their own, like Conway's Game of Life, if you've ever heard of it, that produces lifelike movements out of a single, repeated, inverse operation. Math to history analogies are outrageous, but this is not an analogy. Operations is a mode of thinking that became common in the 19th century, was designed to produce descriptive abstractions that could be applied across contexts, and it's a mode of thinking that we're still living and working within, arguably even now, even more so now than in Marx's time. When this mode of thinking is used on historical sources in the form of applied methodology, I call this downtime, which means an operation that is not derived from historical experience and reflection, but that is at least partially fed down into historical experience as a methodological operation. One of the aims of downtime thinking is what I'd call history hacking. If you can detect the patterns and see how they work and what they mean, you can hack the system, getting it to do what you want it to do or what you think it needs to do anyway. This is the perhaps vulgar Marxist dream. It's also the nationalist dream and the national indifference dream. And insofar as decolonial methodology is a not so distant relative of both Marxism and nationalism, the dream lives on. Transforming an insight gleaned from analysis, historical or otherwise, into an operation is part of what makes a difference in scale amount to a difference in kind. It is this latter effect that warrants further consideration. For instead of working up from data to gain understanding, one takes an understanding thus gleaned and applies it to historical data, and this can be scaled up indefinitely. It also entails flattening a process into a procedure, collapsing in one gesture its duration, the logic of the various steps taken to achieve that understanding, as well as the contextual specificity of both endeavors. I'd like to make an aside here because I'm being a little unfair. No history book would ever be written if we didn't do this act of collapsing, because it would have to be precisely as long with as many characters as history itself. So collapsing is not in itself an inherent bad. We often rightly associate this sort of collapse with democratizing and progressive tendencies, and with good reason. Marxism was in some respect putting the weapons of the strong, the massive destructive knowledge economies of absolutism and imperialism that were gathering statistics and building militaries, into the hands of the weak. There is perhaps nothing more grotesquely imperialist as an acknowledgement of this than the words of the Swiss Denis de Rougemont in his 1970 open letter to the Europeans, in which he decried the decontextualization and dehistoricization, in a word, the operationalization of European imperial contraptions. The whole world, he said, eagerly receives our machines, our doctrines, our remedies, and our poisons, and many of our secrets of material power. In a word, the world receives our products, but it does not receive the religious, ethical, or philosophical value, which alone can explain the genesis of those products, and which alone can help us to keep them in balance. He might as well have said, "We've been hacked." So it's little wonder that history hacking has a good rep. The quick fact is operationalization, turning a historically acquired insight into a technology, does not serve one master. Therein precisely lies its democratizing and anti-imperial potential, in its capacity to invert the meaning of the original or turn the sword of the imperialist on empire itself. Marx and Engels thus admitted on the back channels that they had derived their analytical methods from racial models. And a century later, Donna Haraway saw great feminist potential in the operationalization moves of the hyper-masculine and militaristic cybernetics. But if it doesn't serve just one master, it doesn't just serve the other one either, which helps explain how we got from the locomotive of revolution to blowing out the side door to not believing in trains at all, or how we went from, as I put it, what is to be done to, oh God, what have I/we done? Apparently no speech of any kind can be given in the former Habsburg lands without a Robert Musil quote. And that's what we've come to. This one is from the most sacred text, Man Without Qualities, where Musil is writing about how trains go off rails and how side doors get blown out. The Gospel, according to Robert, reads, as soon as what is disputed has come to dominate, spread, and its fulfillment is no longer associated with particular challenges, the relationship between requirement and prohibition necessarily passes through a decisive stage where duty is no longer born anew and vibrant every day, but drained and broken down into ifs and buts must be kept ready for a variety of uses. And so a process begins in the further course of which virtue and vice become more and more similar to each other through their origin from the same rules, laws, exceptions, and limitations, until finally that strange but basically intolerable self-contradiction arises. And of course, the bastard was onto something. Let's consider some examples. Computer science professor Joseph Weizenbaum wrote a program for an early chatbot called Eliza that was published in 1966. It used formulaic approach to language resembling psychiatric analysis. Eliza as doctor, where a statement entered into the interface is turned into a question or a statement and relayed back to the user. He chose therapeutic language because it was the most simple to replicate. Here's an example. Large text is Eliza. Who else in your family takes care of you? My father. Your father. You are like my father in some ways. What resemblance do you see? You are not very aggressive, but I think you don't want me to notice that. What makes you think I am not aggressive? You don't argue with me. What made Doctor different from other programs, Weizenbaum recalled, was that it was an easy program to demonstrate and could be appreciated on some level by anyone. Thus, the scale of its distribution grew ever wider until it became, quote, a national plaything, unquote. The bot's reception troubled Weizenbaum, especially seeing how what in his mind was a shortcut or a kind of trick of abstraction, in other words, a hack, was being touted as, quote, a general solution to the problem of computer understanding of natural language, unquote. He insisted that, quote, language is understood only in contextual frameworks, and even these can be shared by people to only a limited extent, and even people are not embodiments of such a general solution, unquote. As users and psychiatrists alike started to enthuse about the program's potential to replace human psychiatrists, Weizenbaum regretted having operationalized the psychiatric intervention, the meaning and effectiveness of which should, in his view, be predicated on active listening of another human person. Quote, that it was possible for even one practicing psychiatrist to advocate that this crucial component of the therapeutic process be entirely supplanted by pure technique, that I had not imagined, unquote. He was struck by references to the human therapist as, quote, information processor following rules, unquote. I have traced here a trajectory from operationalization of a process, pure technique, which in turn enables upscaling of its distribution, which in turn legitimates the original collapse of process, which in turn precipitates profound alienation on the part of the program's developer, in this case Weizenbaum, who sees in it something opposite of what should be, and therefore goes on to question the whole endeavor. Broadly speaking, it is a trajectory from what is to be done to what have I done, and it recurs relentlessly across the disciplines. In 2002, the scholar of gender studies and queer theory, Eve Sedgwick, narrated a similar trajectory to paranoia in an essay she titled Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading, or You're So Paranoid You Probably Think This Essay Is About You. She relates how in 1980s queer theory, paranoia was used to illuminate, quote, the mechanisms of homophobic and heterosexist enforcement against homosexuality. By 2002, however, paranoia as an operation saturated the thinking of gender studies, queer theory, and critical theory themselves. Quote, how did it spread so quickly from that status to being its uniquely sanctioned methodology, Sedgwick wondered, with an emphatic incredulity reminiscent of Weizenbaum's. I have been looking back into my own writing of the 1980s, as well as that of some other critics, trying to retrace that transition, one that seems worth of remark now, but seemed at the time, I think, the most natural move in the world. Sedgwick concluded that paranoia tends to be contagious. More specifically, paranoia is drawn toward and tends to construct symmetrical relations, in particular, symmetrical epistemologies. Just as Doctor had mimicked the psychiatric intervention using paranoia as a technique of analysis for homophobia, ensured its mobility as technique of analysis more generally. As technique, it was stripped of its original content and became an operation. And through application and iteration at scale, it tipped from operation to attitude, from critical process to its very opposite, a conditioned response. In other words, the most natural move in the world. 2 years later, the French philosopher and sociologist Bruno Latour wrote an essay titled, Why Has Critique Run Out of Steam? From Matters of Fact to Matters of Concern, in which he charted a similar trajectory for scientific constructivism and critique more generally. Observing the arguments of climate change denialists, he recognized his own method in their madness. I myself have spent some time in the past trying to show the lack of scientific certainty inherent in the construction of facts. I too made it a primary issue, but I did not exactly aim at fooling the public by obscuring the certainty of a closed argument, or did I? I'd like to believe that, on the contrary, I intended to emancipate the public from prematurely naturalized, objectified facts. Was I foolishly mistaken? Have things changed so fast? In which case the danger would no longer be coming from an excessive confidence in ideological arguments posturing as matters of fact, as we have learned to combat so efficiently in the past, but from an excessive distrust of good matters of fact, disguised as bad ideological biases. Italics and exclamation marks relay the jolt as Latour discovers and seeks to reconstruct how it came to be that, quote, dangerous extremists are using the very same argument of social construction to destroy hard-won evidence that could save our lives. Self-consciously saturated in the language of warfare and battle, Latour observes that bad guys can use any weapon at hand. Then, in a palpable run-through-everything fury, Latour makes another go at an explanation. Or maybe it is that critique has been miniaturized, like computers have. I've always fancied that what took great effort, occupied huge rooms, cost a lot of sweat and money for people like Nietzsche and Benjamin, can be had for nothing, much like the supercomputers of the 1950s, which used to fill large halls and expend a vast amount of electricity and heat, but now are accessible for a dime and no bigger than a fingernail. As the recent advertisement of a Hollywood film proclaimed, everything is suspect, everyone is for sale, and nothing is what it seems. In other words, we've been hacked. What is to be done with the insight that there is no method that will serve its intended purpose more than fleetingly, if at all? I could say pragmatically to keep a close eye on your methodologies, maybe diversify your methodological portfolio so you can jump off one quick when it starts to tip, like having a few extra passports in your back pocket for all eventualities. Or I could say, channeling Milorad Pavic in the 1990s, since every method tips, it doesn't really matter which you choose, so just stick with it, saying my method right or wrong. Or I could call for the overthrow of all method and end up at a replica of Goethe's writing desk, crafting handwritten footnotes with no main entry to which they refer, in front of a small but dedicated and well-heeled audience at the Biennale. What I'm going to say, though, is this: that you're smart people. Does or should this matter concern us? I'd like to know what you think. I wish I had an answer myself. I don't, but there is something, a little something that I think I can feel the significance of, and that is that scale has something to do with all of this. And it's the place where I might look for an answer, or to some kind of beginning of an answer. Democratization might be seen in earlier periods as effectively a scalar endeavor. Its drives were towards expansion of the voting franchise, towards increasing the net amount of consciousness in the world. More people should become conscious of very particular facts. And it's also a feature of nationalist historiography, which tries to reach more and more people and to wake them up to the reality of the nation in the 19th century. But what happens when scaling up automatically and immediately means going global? What happens when there's a lot of consciousness? Arguably, there's a surplus of consciousness, so much so that in the film, everywhere, everyone, all at once. What's it? Everything, everywhere, all at once. That one of the tricks is to jump epistemes, and that there are countless epistemes to jump. Is this democratizing? And so I wonder, if we are to think about scale in terms of thinking about method, should we think about how we address our work and what the ultimate aim of it is? Who do we think we're waking up? And how many of them would we want to wake up, and to what kind of reality? And is the scalar move, which is something that is embedded in our time already, is it something that we unintentionally replicate by basically participating in methodological innovations of the sort that increasingly raise the scale of historical analysis? Things that I've engaged in, like transnational history, comparative history. Are these the precise moves that replicate this scalar endeavor? And given that there's almost certainly no way back, how do we think about scalar methodologies in our time? These are open questions, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Holly. And we have around 20 minutes for discussion. We already got a lot of questions from Holly. So, and also I think that it talked to something that was raised in our discussion very much, but as not part of the strictly history, or as we didn't understand it as strictly part of strictly historiographic issues. What do we make if we have a new history for East Central Europe? What's the reason for having it? And how can we imagine to change how society's memory works very much, especially if we accept Holly's rather sober conclusions about how this methodological innovation is also inherently leading to failure of our profession somehow.
No, I don't want to suggest that. I think actually what I've heard here today suggests to me that it's precisely when we're in some respects the most oblivious to certain aspects of methodology that we get the most interesting. And that we are, however, not very listened to. And so I do think there are many arguments to be made for the kind of history that's already being done, or that I've heard being done here today. This isn't meant as a categorical dismissal either of the application of method or of everything that we've done up until this time. It's more, I have this sort of lingering discomfort, and it stems from just aggregate observation of patterns that I'm feeding back into the system, which is if you consider seriously, okay, and there are a lot of moves that we make in historiography that seem absolutely natural, but retrospectively, when we consider them, they don't, we can be alienated by them. This is nothing particularly new, as historians are fond of saying. But I do think that something is changing, and that has something to do with scale. And I think it was raised in the last panel when people were talking about AI and the potential for different kinds of history to emerge, and also whenever one talks about history entering a global key, I also think the scale at which we can even think we can think history is becoming more commonly at that scale. And the natural moves that we trust in that regard, I guess one of the things I was thinking of during the last panel is Jan Schwankmayer's Dimensions of Dialogue, which is a video that a cartoon kind of animation that he made in the 1980s, and it shows like some creature made out of metal and then a creature made out of paper, and they encounter each other, and the metal creature just eats the paper creature and turns the paper creature into lots of tiny pieces of paper. But then the paper creature meets like a biological, like food scraps creature, and the paper creature eats that one. And then in the course of the exchange, metal eats paper, eats bio, etc., you get two perfectly homogeneous subjects facing each other. And maybe it's all right to have homogeneous subjects if that's the part of the end game of history, if you will. But I do think that it's in making methodological gestures, we are often also participating in making the thinking possible that leads towards this form of homogenization. And is there something we can do ever, or should there be a gesture that says, how do we preserve, or maybe preserve isn't the right word, how do we manufacture heterogeneity, or how do we think it a different way? Because the homogenization trends are striking, and the extent to which, and it was exciting, I remember in the in the 90s and the 2000s, when we were just becoming historians, to think about, oh, all of these wonderful exchanges that are taking place. But then it's also a little sad when everyone has precisely the same terms in which they're talking about things. And I had a former student who wants to write about like what happened with sort of epistemic abyss after the collapse of state socialism. There are entire data sets that, you know, scientists of the Soviet and socialist era made that are sort of floating out there in some kind of like, and, you know, like, and they have no use, or there's no world for them to be in. And it's not that there necessarily should be, but it is kind of interesting. It's indicative of the homogenization of various fields, that it's not even really possible to revive or to reanimate or to think across epistemes, or, you know, like, or that it's difficult.
So I saw Adam raising his hand.
Oh no, it's coming, it's coming.
So it's interesting because I had the opposite observation that exactly these 2 days show that we are not homogenizing, but anyway, but I was really stunned by your statement in the beginning of your talk, saying that Marx invented the historical method, and I was thinking, is it really true? So we are all historians are Marxists, or before Marx, there was no historical method, or in his time, there were no other historical thinkers who used other methods, or so is it? So, I mean, you painted a beautiful picture, but I don't know if so. I'm just stunned by your statement, and I'm not sure if it's correct.
I think any generalization is incorrect in some respect. I think Marx was probably a rigor, you know, like he rigorized methodology. I think there were some antecedents to that form of rigor. And if we consider methodology to be anyway plural, I mean, and if we consider things like just considering a particular angle on history, military, diplomatic, as methodologies, which they weren't formulated as such at the time, but they could be construed as methodologies. And there are definitely typologies of history that go back to ancient Greece. I mean, there's nothing, or, you know, so it's not that a plurality of historical approaches doesn't exist before Marx. I think what I'm talking about is that there is something like a singularity of historical approach that starts to gain traction with Marx, like a very particular sense of method that is then, you know, like, you know how you know Freud, even if you've never read Freud, you know, about the subconscious, you know, like that there is something about Marxism. There is what someone referred to as a Marx-shaped hole. Whenever his name doesn't come up, there is still some aspect of what we do that, even if we're not Marxist historians in that sense, I think owes something, or has some remnant of Marx's notion of methodology, because we're not von Rankeans, that's pretty sure. But I think I agree with you in your first point, which is I don't think that, I don't think that that what I've heard said here suggests that the field is homogeneous, but I do think that the world and our, you know, that and a lot of the methodologies that we apply to the world are increasingly standardized, and that I made many gross generalizations. And so I love the historian sensibilities that it says, but in 1862, yes, please, more 1862, you know, but, and then the question is, how does the 1862, what is the place of 1862 in the world, in our world, and what can it be that it isn't quite yet? in the face of these homogenizing or these, replicating methodologies.
Raoul, and afterwards Martin.
Thank you. Can I have 3 questions? The first has to do with the metaphor of the locomotive and the side door, and in Snowpiercer, I find it interesting, like you say, the motion is a forward motion within a forward motion. It's a revolution within a revolution. You started by talking about the doubts with respect to the possibility of forward movement. And I'm wondering if those can be connected in our present day in any way to presentism. I mean, François Hartog's concept of presentism as the block ahead. Would the present be the reason why we see this impossibility of forward movement? Keeping to the metaphor of the locomotive, you talked about the side door, and you wondered whether anti-colonialism or post-colonialism could be a side door. But your overall approach, talking about operationalization, means that every method eventually can be hacked and will be hacked, or is at least very likely to be hacked. And anti-colonialism and post-colonialism have been around for long enough to have been hacked, and have, again, we know they have been. So can there ever be a side door that doesn't become a locomotive that is then eventually hacked? And my third question had to do with your question about scales and scalar thinking and scalar methodologies, because that's the part that gets me intrigued. But scale is very spatial as a concept, and I'm wondering if the scaling, the way you hinted at it, if not explicitly talked about it, can also be time scales in the overall order of things. Thank you.
This is excellent. These are great questions. So on the subject of presentism, yes, I mean, I think the possibility that all objects can be reanimated, repositioned in time, and zapped into the present, it creates what I think Paul was talking about when he was talking about fear. This is one of the sources of contemporary fear, that any object from the past can suddenly be made relevant in a way that you can't anticipate. And this presentism has a paralytic, insofar as that's presentism, the possibility that anything can enter, can be zapped from the past into the present. It's anxiety producing, and you can feel like the implications of, oh, really, anything? Does that mean this? Does that mean that? Does that mean? And it means the potential for eternal reinterpretation and reversal. And this that goes to your second question, which is, is there something that can't be hacked? I think that's a good question. It's sort of the question I entered with, but I think for my own purposes, it's sort of like, I want to ask a different question. I just don't know what that question is, because of course there's nothing that can't be hacked. We're all historicists here, we know better, right? Everything's historical. But there is something that, about historicism, that if you told this story a different way, like it would be about what happens when you're living in a post-historicist world as a historian, because I think we are. Like historicism, as it came into being in the 19th century, accidentally produced trans-historical claims about the validity of context. It didn't mean to, like a lot of these things, but when you say that context always matters, you are aiming for a chess move that always wins, that always has the thing to do next. And historicism always won, and it was infuriating in that way, because it always had an answer. Well, it's historical. And in so doing, it made the historical a trans-historical answer. And it lost some of its original teeth and validity, because the arguments it was making against its opponents no longer, its opponents had been vanquished to such an extent that they didn't even have words to say. And so I think what we're seeing is something else, But we're still historians, right? We still think, but context, but really, I'm not kidding. And it's true, there is still something there. But I think it behooves us to understand, what is this post-historicist world? And my half thought on that is that we're living in an age of psychologism, where the hacks take place not because you win every time with the historicist argument, but because you win every time with the psychological argument. And by that, I mean that algorithms are based on their capacity to predict future behaviors out of sort of black box behaviorism. The ultimate explanation that sort of wins every debate is, well, that's how the mind works, rather than it's historical. Somehow, historicism had some role in this, I think, because insofar as historicism had psychology as a form of context, and it had a moving psychology, a moving psychological feast, if you will, that transformed over time. And so it used psychology quite a lot. It leaned on it. But I think what's happened is the psychology got fixed in time, which goes to your question about, what's been lost in a post-historicist world is that psychologism is so flat. It's so transhistorical. It wins on the temporal scale every time, because it never changes. If a mind works like that, it just works like that. It's always worked like that. And your mind might work different than my mind. That's why we have separate algorithms. You have yours, I have mine. But yours is going to work like that. Mine's going to work like that transhistorically. Done deal. This is like cybernetics on crack. And so this desire for like an explanation that functions once and for all time, I feel like this desire is what I'm thematizing, but I'm not sure that it's a bad desire, but we know that it's not possible. Historians, more than anyone. Thankfully, if it were possible, we'd be screwed. And, but we don't, we know we're also living in a time where the contextualizing move often loses. And so the question is, there is still something to be said for context. And so when, how, where, and, if you scale up context, it's not context anymore. And so it becomes decontextualized. So that's sort of what I would say about side doors and timescales also.
Very inspiring. I wanted to ask you a small thing. Could you draw us in 3 sentences? Where did we come from the 1990s or postmodernism? How did we get from there to the decolonial and postcolonial? Just because you mentioned Latour and his sort of soul searching, I was intrigued by that quote. But really, what changed? Because many of the problems seem to be there, at least in the East Central European context, in the post-89 context, when sort of postmodern theory has been interpreted from the left, from the right, from the liberal angles in quite often self-serving ways. That's the first question. And the second question is related to history hacking and downtime that you started your talk with. To what extent are these textual problems and related to the writing of history? You also mentioned films, but those seem to be much more open-ended to me. So should we all be shooting movies instead of writing history? Just small things,
I was thinking about this matter. I'll work backwards today because I just read Georgi Gospodinov's novel, Time Shelter. And he manages to do a lot that we can't do with relationships to the past, the movability of the past. It's really quite wonderful. I mean, he manages to describe now by describing his, how now relates to the past. And that's super useful and very interesting. That's not our job unless we're presentists. So some part of our job might be for some historians, more for others, to explain exclusively and only now. But if we think that there's something like a then that to which we're also at least semi-responsible, then I think our problems lie slightly elsewhere. But I do think that literature and films have captured something about what happened since the 1990s. I think Everything Everywhere All at Once really captures what it's like to serially wake up into a different episteme, like over and over again. And I think if I were to try to, and yeah, I think I read a novella by a Czech writer that was written in the interwar period about a guy who goes into a pub and drinks himself silly, passes out, goes to an upstairs room, falls asleep, wakes up, and then realizes that that whole previous day was a dream, goes out, goes to a pub, drinks himself silly, goes to bed upstairs in some pub, wakes up and realizes that too was a dream, and that, I never finished it and I can't find it again, so I don't know if I dreamt it, but this feels real. Like this feels like a description of, some version of the way people started to experience some element of historical time. And I think Everything Everywhere All at Once gets that. It gets that whenever you jump epistemes, whenever you think you've woken up, earlier you would wake up to an episteme and you would think, I'm done. I've just woken up for real. I've exited the cave. And it was just one, and then you've had your conversion experience and it's over. But then it started happening. No, there's not just one. There's another one, and there's another one, and there's another one. And after a while, you don't know, especially in this region when people are being constantly woken up to different epistemes, like you don't know, like, was that one better than this one? Or is this the last one? Or was that the last one? Because if that was the last one, then why aren't we still in it? So there's this jumping epistemes problem that the film gets, because whenever you jump an episteme in Everything Everywhere All at Once, you have to do something incredibly painful and counterintuitive. You have to give yourself like a paper cut on each finger, or like shove something painful in your mouth or in another orifice. Like you have to do something outrageous and crazy, and that will get you to another world. And that's like blowing out the side door. Just when you're thinking, train, we're going, if we want revolution, we go forward. Then someone blows out the side door and you're with polar bears. And that's what it's like, or some version of what it's like. And I think if I were to answer the question, try to answer what happened since the 1990s, I would do it this way. And this is just like completely provisional. So I was reading on the Middle Ages, and he says something that happened at the end of the Middle Ages that sort of marked their end. And he said, at the beginning of the Middle Ages, people would be tortured and executed in order that their souls be saved. At the end of the Middle Ages, they were tortured and executed, and they weren't allowed to confess. The whole meaning behind torture and execution is hollowed out into a process, into an operation, and it's running hollow. It's absolutely empty. And I think there is something about the way periods end that doesn't catch up right away. It doesn't happen instantaneously, but definitely some period has come to an end. And some other period is coming into being, because you can feel how hollowed out certain gestures are. You can feel how they don't do what they're supposed to be doing. And lots of people are tapping in lots of different directions to try to figure out what comes next. And I think our region is very heavily implicated in this. 1989 was the beginning of some ending, or like it was a non-incidental moment in the trajectory of the hollowing out of the meaning of particular. I watched recently the Book of Mormon together with Everything Everywhere All at Once. The Book of Mormon is from the 1990s. It's by the South Park people, if any of you know South Park. Super cynical, no bottom to that cynicism. You cannot touch the ground cynically with South Park. It just goes and it keeps on going as though there's literally no tomorrow. And with Everything Everywhere All at Once, the whole film is about how you fight cynicism, and you have to fight it tooth and nail. And it's not guaranteed that you will win. And it is a powerful adversary. It wins every time. And so you can see like some aspect of the zeitgeist is turning, like that the cynicism of the 90s is starting to produce some kind of sensibility that provokes the very interesting question that was posed on, like, what about a grand narrative? What about some hope? What about some meaning? Hey, throw us a bone, just meaning. Tell me what it means. Like even that would be something. Like, and so that tapping around for something that isn't like the spiraling donut, or it's like a bagel, it's an everything bagel. The hole at the center of the everything bagel. And I think that film is onto something. I don't think, you know, I would love to make films, but, you know, probably I should stick to the day job.
Okay, thank you. This might be a naive question, but related to the scaling up and to the application of methods. And so I think I just want to understand, isn't it a way of communicating between historians or between communities of historians? Or to put it differently, is there any other way for them to communicate? So, for example, taking up the new imperial history approach in Eastern Europe is, in a way, a gesture of communicating, of trying to see eye to eye, or seeing whether that's possible with other historians of other regions or of other places, or this sort of professional communication could be done in a way that wouldn't lead to this hacking and this ideoscapes which escape, and then we don't know what they mean later on.
That's a good point. And it reminds me of like when I'm sitting in a department meeting and deciding on a policy, and it means a lot of extra work for everyone. And I think, but it's a really good policy. And then everyone says, it's the most natural thing in the world that we should make this policy because it's good. And it means that we'll have better, smoother relations, and we won't abuse our graduate students as much, and we'll be doing X and Y. That's better. It's a force of improvement. And it's all true. And that's why these logics have some sort of irresistibility. There's a human element to them. And there's something wonderful about that human element. And I've never stopped, you know, I tried once and I felt horrible saying, hey, bureaucracy, time, you know, our search procedures are 17 pages long, you know, like, is there anything that we could do, you know, like to, you know, have less rather than more? And I don't even know how to answer that question in a way that's super responsible. But it is, you know, like also undeniably the case that one gets incredibly, you know, like that one gets frustrated with the extent to which people start making arguments that are arguably disconnected even to, you know, the experiential languages of the people there, but that's not necessarily a problem in the grand scheme of things. And one can think of good reasons because one wants these languages to be more widespread, but then comes the upscaling, then comes the general audience, and then comes, you know, like all of these things. I mean, I think of it oftentimes, Facebook was harmless when there were like 60 users. You know, like Facebook is satanic now. It's at its size. It's not even Facebook anymore. It's Meta. You know, like at scale, things become actually different. And this isn't an argument for not speaking to the public, but every time like that we think that we have to scale an idea up, are we therefore also collapsing just one more time? So first we put it in a book, and then it's kind of pamphlet size, and then it's 3 sentences. And what, can what we really mean be truly reconstructed from those 3 sentences? It becomes an operation, and then those 3 sentences get quoted, fed back down, and like somehow those 3 sentences become the meaning of the thing. Whereas, we already collapsed it in the book. And so I think there's some dynamic. For a while I was thinking, like about some version of the revival of, as an initial form of human interaction, even if not the ultimate form, of samizdat. Like, yes, we have these human networks. Why don't we first publish for each other, to have the conversations, and then think, what would it mean to publish this thing? Like, what does it mean to, like take the next step? And to whom do we want to address the next step? And who's this we that we're talking about? It's just a thought experiment. I'd be keen to hear what you think, because I recognize the power of what you're talking about. I feel it all the time. I don't feel like I can resist it, but I do feel like there's a lot that's lost ultimately. Not just lost, but a lot of opportunities that aren't followed through on, or that there must be other stuff out there. There must be more, different somehow.
We had Matthias Bohl, and we also have a question from
Yes. So I think I would like to follow on from a comment from Adam, and that is that there were sort of historical methodologies before Marx and after Marx and next to Marx, and to which I would ask, I mean, aren't there also different methodologies within Marx? Is there not more than one Marx? I mean, when you look at different sub-disciplines of history, none of them is completely uninfluenced by Marx, but they take off very different things. So probably if you ask an economic historian for what influenced them most of Marx, they would take this famous sentence, das Sein bestimmt das Bewusstsein und nicht das Bewusstsein das Sein. But when I then go to historical conferences, including this one, it sometimes seems to me that sort of the economic historians are the ones most strongly, or perhaps the only ones, insisting on the relevance of this sentence, whereas other subdisciplines, they take away very different concepts from Marx. So, I mean, yeah.
Agreed. I mean, I'm perfectly, I think methodologies are plural. And my point was more to speak of methodology as a form of abstraction and operation, an operation that's applied, fed back into history. But I feel strongly, and I've said this, that it's not a self-replicating machine. It produces infinite variety. That's why when you have a new methodology, then you can run a Foucauldian analysis till kingdom come. And it always produces a little something new. But it also, after a while, doesn't quite work the way it's supposed to, or the way that the people who, thought of it imagined it was like, doesn't do the things that it was designed from, like its historical derivation to do. And so it was that phenomenon rather than the plurality that I sought to thematize and question. But no, absolutely, methods are plural, even within Marxism, and even beyond Marxism, they're incredibly plural. And even within a single methodology, the possibilities for producing new material is infinite. I had a section in the thing that I cut on filling holes as a method, as a methodological sort of like form. And I think this filling holes has a scalar implication also. So there's a tacit, I think, assumption that we share with data analysts, and that is that, it's that there is such a thing as all the data, a complete data set. We may not have it, but it's out there, and it's like this dream. And filling holes is some manifestation of this dream, of getting closer to the perfect data set, the most complete data set. But I think this also unintentionally produces like a kind of economy of scale of historical analysis that does some of these things that I've been describing. And so filling holes too has some logic to it that I think I would like to thematize, but I only have half thoughts on this. They're not really that well developed, but it's a good question.
Yes, you say the religion word was quite interesting. Another word which we didn't hear so much in this region. That's quite funny. And but the way you mentioned it, I think it relates to the very specific relationship between religion and essentialism, and at the same time, religion and timelines. Religion is a very interesting phenomenon because it has a cycle type of time, an arrow type of time, and a non-time. In the same action.
Christianity, you mean?
Not only. It's almost all religions have at least cycles, non-time, sometimes arrow type of time. And my question was, how do you see your questioning about the way history tries to cope with these hopefully never-ending collapses and scale change, and the confrontation with religion?
Well, one could take this in a couple of directions. One would be to talk about the confrontation of these ideas, you know, like with actual religion. Is that what you mean? Like, or how these ideas play themselves out differently in religious contexts? Actually, I think some of the most intriguing parallels to what I'm talking about are within this area. And because I feel like the Snowpiercer is a sort of tacit, statement that there is, in spite of modernity, there's still some cyclical time. And the revolution is a going around, and it's a repetition of the loop. And you go around to the same place every time. And so the blowing out the side door in the subplot is interesting because the Korean characters notice that something has changed outside, but nothing, interestingly, has changed inside. And I think this is what's become different, this is what makes it different from there's always an outside in religion, at least in theory. But I think the abandonment, the self-conscious abandonment of the idea of an Archimedean point that isn't the social within modernity means that the cycle can only be imagined as an internal phenomenon, that it's interesting that the side door has to be blown, some outside has to be reformulated. And that is a different kind of reach for meaning, I would say, like a saying that, no, the inside is not enough, or like some acknowledgement of that. I don't think that and it's not, I don't think in the film's case, this is an argument for a return to religion by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think it is a reanimation of the idea that outside is important. And this death of outside within, let's say, broadly speaking, the Western tradition has resulted, or makes it seem like it's always eating its own tail. And I think, especially from the outside, if you will. By from the outside, if you read decolonial texts. Another thing that's very interesting, I think, is there's a new tendency within some African American thought on temporality or like indigeneity towards this thing that I think, Raul, maybe you were talking about it, or maybe it was you, Paul, about inhabiting, like this notion that you inhabit a bad time or a time that's corrupted by, like some epistemic taint or some problem that you're never going to solve. And you just like move into it. You haunt it as a ghost, like, and you become transhistorical, or you sit in its wake and you exist in the wake. That's Christina Sharp's formulation. And so you see an increasing number of formulations that are anti-movement, actually, and that just are sort of like, they either are transhistoricizing or they're situating locationally, like that they're never going to go away and they're going to stay in this place, and that's where some potential comes, because it's the movement that's suspect.
We have one question from the audience, so I will first read it out loud. So it's oh, you okay? So you see that.
Oh, am I answering the screen question?
Yes. Can you read it?
Oh, hacking, I think. Yes. Yeah, hacking methodologies. Yes, generational change. I had another section that I cut that was on Rorty and philosophy. It went way off the rails in a very Snowpiercer way. And it wasn't a good blowing out of the side door, but it touches upon this issue. So I think what Rorty did is he tried to bring historicism to philosophy. So he's tried to say that a philosophy, what it does basically is that it tells you at any given time what it is you have to keep and what it is you have to let go of. And so it's, he made it historicist. And this makes sense when the horizon of change is maybe generational or maybe Kuhnian, like scientific revolutions. It's mesoscalar, it's a lifetime. You can sort of say you might live through one, maybe two epistemic tips, but not 16. Like it makes sense if that's the world you're living in. But generations is sort of on that mesoscale. But I think what's changing is the rapidity with which epistemes come and go, and there's some partialness about their epistemic reality. They're almost like they shimmer and shudder. They're super real, but they're nowhere, because they're in this virtual space that is completely narrativized in their terms. But, like if you look for it on the street, you might find it in some manifestations, but like it's hard to locate it like in a particular place. And this sense that epistemes are both like that they change very rapidly, that they're super intense but vanishingly brief, and this experience I think is different from, cause that what Rorty was talking about is a world where you have to get accustomed to existing within a new one because the horizon of social change has accelerated some, but now it's accelerated arguably lots. And I don't think that generational change accommodates totally that degree of acceleration. But that's just a thought, half thought.
Okay, and probably the last one, Raul.
Yeah. I thought about careerism, by the way. There's a lot there. Actually, Conway's Game of Life, if you look at it, it's about turning like a chip that's white, turning it black, and then turning another chip from white to black. So it's like turning some little things into their opposites. And I think academia kind of works like this because, like it proceeds by argument and counter argument. And, what Conway's Game of Life does is that it produces these kind of lifelike figures that if you follow multiple iterations, they start to like squiggle and squirm across the page as if they're alive. And so this little operation repeated over and over again produces, like this image of life. And I think, the operation that it does is precisely this flip of what happened last.
Talking about Snowpiercer, mine is a very literalist reading because there's one element to the polar bear. They're in the train because the world's dead, right? I mean, they tried to fix climate change. They shot rockets into space to cool down the atmosphere. It all went to hell and they all died. And the only people alive, the only things alive are in the train. And that's the only reason why the train is going. And it's, like you said, it's literally revolution because it's moving forward. But every once a year, which is, again, once a year, it gets to the same point, exact same point, which is the only point where you can stop it, blow it up, try to do something about it, right? They choose the right moment. But the opening of the door and the polar bear means there's life outside it. But I think I literally took this to have to do with climate change. And that was also what I was getting with presentism and what I think Hartog gets with presentism. That this notion of infinite development, which was the premise of modernity, of constant moving forward, has reached a point where we know it's not happening, that there is an end or a very likely end. Coming soon, that climate will kill us all in a matter of a couple of generations, if I'm optimistic. And that presentism for him is not just reading the past through the lens of the present. That's one dimension of it. The other one is the blockage in the future, the bloating of memory, especially since Holocaust memory and memory studies and what have we done. The present is hyperinflated and there's no future. And to some extent, I think that's where Snowpiercer and the blowing up of the side exit and the polar bear is a bit optimistic, right? Because
there's a polar bear.
There's a polar bear. He survived somehow. They survived. Not everything is dead.
Now he's got 2 people to eat.
Exactly. That was my reading of the ending was like, wow, food. Like, from the point of view of the polar bear, it's a great moment right there. Like 2 have survived this dinner. But seriously speaking, and it might relate to what Paul was saying, you need an outside at this point, because inside it's just self-reproducing.
That's a very good point. And I actually think that in terms of the horizon of our thinking, and this is not, just a thought problem, but some aspects of it have very clear thought, some elements that clearly don't, come from the necessity of climate change. And those are like the language that's used to, because our moral baseline is World War II and the Holocaust for good and evil. And it's like what I'm observing that I find incredibly interesting, but also quite disturbing, is like taking that language and that, those frameworks, the very words, the analogies, and projecting them into the future, basically projecting holocausts into the future. Like the time horizon for thinking the Holocaust and World War II used to be kind of never again, that you hold back some tendency and that, the present is like your push point so that you keep it at bay. Whereas now it's just like a point where you pass through so that, because your potential locus of moral certainty has to be ahead of you and not behind you, but it's like the same one projected into the future. And so like Kim Stanley Robinson predicts, 80 million dead on a single day. And even the language of comparison, like Andreas Malm and How to Blow Up a Pipeline, he also talks about the Warsaw Ghetto. Dipesh Chakrabarty talks about how, we gave up on fear, you know, like, and it was freedom from fear that the Atlantic Charter was all about. And Chakrabarty says, bring back fear, because that was the sensibility we need. That's the one we need to address climate change. And so there are all of these, like, you can see that moral baseline being transported, and it's not even, it's like being thrown like a ball to the future that we, you know, that on the one hand we have to avoid, so we have to hold back the future, but also it's like rushing inevitably, you know, in our direction. And that, some of that is a thought matter, because, you know, like, I think mass death is quite conceivable, but that it should be framed in those terms is not, you know, like, or that we should think, that we should feel like we need to think of it in those terms in order to do whatever it is that we have to do, is quite interesting. And the implications, that's like putting it gymnastically, which it's way worse than, it's just, it's off, you know, don't even get me started. But like the, like, it's an open, it's, for me, it's an open question. Okay, like, oftentimes when you take something that's a moral baseline in the past, or if you think about projecting it into the future, then you're ready. You've already thought it. You're ready for it. You know, like there's some part of you that will, you know, like see bits of it out of reality, or that will say, oh, that was inevitable when it comes, or like, I wonder what the effect of thinking in that way is. And so it's a real question, because I see that its wish is to be preventative. But, you know, like my last book, Age of Questions, I think lots of people did these, well, we can't solve any single question without solving them all, and we can't solve them all without a war, and we, you know, like, and so there's some kind of logic that's potentially catastrophic.
I think we finished.
Upbeat.
Well, we finished. At least the panel, certainly. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I really don't want to say too much for closing of the conference, but it's one official part of the conference. We are very well over time. Honestly speaking, when I was organizing the conference, I was not thinking of any kind of specific outcome, but that might be raised in a way. I don't think, or I will think of what to do with. What actually, it's less to do with the conference and more to do with the whole complex issue of what to do with history, or what to do with Eastern European history, or what to do with history for Europe. As that started to think about a few months ago, and it still haunts me, somehow whether there is a way to somehow, well, if not perpetuate, but continue these kind of discussions that I think are very, very useful for everyone participating in it. But that's not a promise. It's really just some random thoughts about, and if anyone has more experience with it, that's one of the useful ways to do it. Could be some kind of idea about how we can, or whether it is worth to think about making a kind of cost action like format to continue these discussions, which is not so easy to formulate into work packages, but Raoul's insistence on, but how do we transmit these issues to the, suddenly makes it at least 2 possible work packages. That's more than 1. So I just telling you that please don't be surprised if I come back with some mad ideas about continuations or potential applications, whatever, but it's not for the next few weeks to bother you with it. I think it was really.
I just want to, if we could all just thank Gabor and the organizers of this conference most sincerely, and for the NEPOSTRANS.